Hello, everyone. Before we get to the meat of the meeting, I'm going to share my screen. And of course, we have our intro slide to give everyone context of what's happening here. We're going to have an interesting project by Heather Meeker regarding an oral history of open source. Now, this meeting, as with every other meeting of the OpenChain project, is covered by the Linux Foundation Antitrust Policy Notice. You can find the full policy on our website, and if you're a Linux Foundation member, you can contact our council, Andy Updegrove, with any questions. We're going to jump right into the recording, which Heather has prepared for us. She's also on the line to take any questions and comments you may have. We'll do that after the video itself. Well, let's dive straight in. I'm going to prepare to share the video and play it. As always, if there's any issue with the audio or other aspects of the video, just let me know and we'll resolve those straight away. And here we go.
Open source has changed the world, and it's changed the world greatly for the better. It's a movement that's been going on for quite a while now, and it didn't start because of a government or a company or a politician. It started really from people who wanted to change the way people had access to software, because software is so important to all our lives now. Whether you know it or not, you are using open source software right now, and you're probably using it every moment of your life. And that's due to a very dedicated group of people who started and who grew this movement over many years. Because this is such an important change in our world, and because it happened in the way it did, I thought it was important to capture the personal stories of people involved in this movement. What made them so dedicated? What made them understand that this was so important?
You know, I'm not sure that we ever, or certainly I never made an initial decision that, oh, I want to build an open source audio editor and distribute it in the world, and it'll become the most popular.
Millions of copies, and
yeah, it'll be the primary editor of its kind in the world. That just never crossed our minds. Even, you know, at that time, which was around 2000, you know, most people in the world didn't have the kinds of computers or the kinds of network connections and everything else that you would need to even distribute something like this. It grew out of some very personal goals and needs in a lab, and it just kind of happened to be useful for some other things and make its way gradually out into the world and develop into what it is now.
There were a couple of terminals left in the room that nobody was using because they were meant for the organizers of the place. You had to log in, and of course I didn't have a password. But somehow a few friends of mine managed to hack into the computers and into these terminals. And got noticed, well, or caught. I don't know but they were nice enough to say, "Oh, you seem to be, doing pretty well with these things. So why don't we open up an account for you?" There was one guy that I met there who had a long beard and long hair, and whose name is Richard M. Stallman. So I met this guy who was just, an ordinary guy. More hairy than most, but still.
Well, I guess one of the first itch I needed to scratch was that I was spending all of my time on Linux because as grad students, we all got a Linux system on our desk to do our computer science homework and to develop software. But all of the audio software we had only ran on Windows or Mac. And so there wasn't really anything that I could use just to do even basic manipulation to do this research. And so it's really good that I was naive, because I just thought, oh, well, I'll just build a little audio editor. How hard could it be? If I had known that, it would consume the next 10 plus years of my life, maybe I wouldn't have gotten started. But
the idea of a community and bringing people in really came about after the initial work. It was just us, and we were using the software and released the software, but then later other people sort of started using it and wanted to make improvements. And
I was a Debian project leader. I had never actually met another Debian developer, and fanned it out. And these 50 people who also did not physically know each other combined to create a working, running operating system. Also, the fact that open source let us all sort of look over each other's shoulders and help each other was very useful as well. So all of these people who had no common employer, who hadn't met at that time, and who really only had their own private goals driving this. I think at that point, none of them were actually doing this for their employer. Combined to create a working operating system that, among other things, flew on the space shuttle. My original investment of a month of evenings I should have been spending with my wife really was tremendously expanded by the subsequent work of all of these people, which they did under the GPL license, contribute when in some cases the incentive for them would have been to keep their modifications private.
No, I don't think there was an aha moment. I think it was more that was the culture that I was in. So the culture I was surrounded with was one about sharing code and learning from others. And so it wasn't as much an aha moment as much as just that was the environment I was in. And so it seemed like the only natural thing to do to share any code that I wrote, just like everyone had shared all their code with me.
Maybe open source is really an outgrowth of the academic world, where in academia we do research, and we get the rewards are not so much money but recognition, that people want to be recognized for making contributions to whatever field they do research or writing in. And so we publish, but we don't publish, and sign book deals. Well, actually, we do sign book deals, but terrible deals. Right? We're lucky. We're lucky to get anyone to publish anything.
There are very many embedded devices for the most mundane uses, aquarium temperature controllers, that all have this software in them. And webcams, all kinds of things. And so for something that I spent a month upon, I did not ever receive financial compensation directly from it, but it has tens and hundreds of millions of users. All right, users who don't necessarily even know that it exists, but there is some pride in that. Just as an artist likes to have their paintings appreciated, a programmer likes to have lots of users and lots of things happening with their software. And today I know that a jet plane does not fly without using BusyBox, and you don't you probably don't wake up and get into your day without using BusyBox, and so that's really fun, and it was worth that month of evenings. And Valerie and I are still together, even though I probably neglected her for that whole month.
But then, yeah, over time, I did start finding some other interested contributors, just people who found the project. It seemed interesting to them, and they started joining in, making contributions, and that was a lot of what made it really fun for me, because it was something that we could do whatever we wanted with it, and everyone who contributed could work on whatever they felt like. But it was still fun and collaborative, and so it was fun to bounce ideas off people, to see other people's contributions, to discuss the best way to do things, to discuss how to turn it into a larger, more successful project. And that was just tons of fun. It was a very different experience than I ever had, either doing classwork or at a job or internship where I was building software that someone else was in charge of and they had their own vision for. This is something where it could be my vision, and anyone who wanted to contribute, they could all contribute to that vision.
So I remember at the time someone saying to me, well, Pixar is having its IPO, and you have Toy Story coming out, and isn't this wonderful? And at the time, the space shuttle had just launched with Debian Linux and the Biosciences project on it. And I said, well, it's cool to have a movie in theaters and to have an IPO that's being very successful. But my hobby project is orbiting in space, and that's actually more fulfilling to me.
Back, because suddenly we were not in the shadow of AOL, and suddenly we were something important, and we were a bit helpless. And that means that some people were interested in helping us. Suddenly, the French unemployment agency was asking me whether I was sending resumes, and stuff like that, or whether I was creating a company. And I was not creating a company, these are the two options, basically. And then they would threaten to stop the benefits from coming. And I managed to be lucky enough to be discussing with a guy who was nice and understanding, and said, so you're building a nonprofit? Yes, and we're going to crush Microsoft. yeah, sure. But so I would show him emails from Mitchell Baker and from the Mozilla Foundation and stuff like that. He wouldn't speak a word of English. They translate me, so I could have,
could have said
anything. But I did not. I was so yes, we were discussing, so that we could use the Mozilla brand and stuff like that. And he said, yeah, sure, it's fine. And in the end, we ended up creating hundreds of jobs in Europe. So he was right, but at the time it was a bit far-fetched to to believe me and believe that I would succeed.
Also, if you're one of these programmers who has some social issues, computing is a very comfortable environment for you, because your computer doesn't dislike you and not work with you because it doesn't like your face. Your program runs if it's correct, and it doesn't run until it's correct. And so that was also something that was very comfortable for the kind of person who really does like to stay in their cube and code, and, do their work with the world that way. Now, I sort of bridged both of those worlds. Uh, I think people know this by now. I am not neurotypical, um, and so I have some of those issues, but I'm also very, very well trained.
The open source community did allow for a lot of anonymous contributions.
Mhm.
I mean, some people even might have used their name, but without any other identifiable information. It's hard to know where in the world someone lives or how old they are. It's really fascinating to get contributions for someone and later learn that they're a teenager, or that they're that they're a senior citizen and that they're retired and have taken up programming after an entirely different career, or any number of things, right? They could be coming from anywhere in the world. And I always found that aspect really fascinating too. You get to know someone purely by their technical contributions, and later, if you're lucky, you might get to learn things about their personal life, or they might just remain mysterious.
There were projects that at the time people just would have been considered nuts for working on. But when you have 50 nuts who believe the same as you on the internet, you're more powerful than any startup company. And so today you can achieve incredible things. And I would encourage everyone to give that a try and see if they can do it.
Well, I hope you enjoy listening to the stories in this archive. And I hope it helps make you think about how people can change the world. Thanks so much for listening.
All right, everyone. So I'd like to jump right into the questions, if I might. So Heather, for the people who aren't particularly familiar with you, you've actually been involved in open source law, the open source community, and now you're working on cutting edge stuff around basically how innovative open source startups can get funded. So you've been around for a long time.
I have an embarrassingly long time.
Not in a bad way, in a good way.
No, in a good way.
When it came to collating this oral history project, if I understand correctly, part of the inspiration came during the pandemic pause in the planet. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. By the way, I should say that these are just some small clips from the interviews that I did as a kind of a pilot project. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But yeah, the idea for this came honestly when one of our community died during the early days of the pandemic. I don't believe he died from COVID, but I think we were all doing some introspection during the pandemic times. And as I was sitting there at my desk, I thought, there are a lot of people I know, like what I would consider my cohort, many of whom are sort of approaching retirement or getting into maybe the last parts of their career. And if we don't capture their stories now, they'll be gone. And it also, it occurred to me that there's a lot written about open source and about a lot of the people whom I hope would be involved in this project. But what you see it's more like advocacy or talking about open source issues. This is really a project about personal motivations, which, as I said, I thought were so important because it's important to understand why people would give so much of their time and energy to something that everyone could use freely. That's a really generous act. And I think maybe there should be more of that in the world. And so I wanted to capture, like, why did this first generation at least do this? And, so what can we learn about that for other things that we do in life?
This leads us to an interesting question about, are the next generations doing this? Are people becoming more mercenary again, or is that spirit of contribution still out there?
Oh, I think it is. I mean, obviously, I just am sitting from my perspective, but I just see so many people developing things, and they may want to make a living out of it, but I don't think that's why they do it, because by the time they're making out a living out of it, they've already paid it forward quite a bit. So, and I really do see, like, as a venture capitalist now in this area, I see a lot of the younger people really have a generous spirit. That's actually why I do it. I like working with the founders who, by the time we even talk to them, and we're very early stage, they've already, done a lot to enable other people to use their software without any reward at all. So they definitely have to pay it forward.
Now, Yari had a question in the comments, and his question pointed out that there's a lot more emphasis on contributions other than code now than there was previously. And do you know of stories about these people who are helping out open source, but they're not coders? And how that collaboration worked, how that learning worked. I'm not sure if I've seen much of that type of history yet. Just curious about your.
Yeah, I would love that to be part of this project. So to be clear, this project is nascent. Those 4 interviews were 4 pilot interviews that I did. And I am trying to get support, funding, participation to expand the project greatly. And I would really like to include people who are not coders, people who are doing all sorts of things, community management and documentation and testing and all the things that the non-coders do, which is extremely significant, or people who were running projects and so forth. So I'd very much like to include that, but they're not included yet, mainly because these 4 were just 4 people I knew who were willing to spend an hour with me. And I want to make clear, like, this is not, I hope this is not my project. I want it to be a community project. And I don't want to actually run the project, right? I kind of funded the initial pilot, but I really want it to grow way beyond what it is now, and hopefully have it open to just about anybody who wants to tell their story about open source.
That leads us, I guess, to how can we help? How can people get involved in the project and help with the lift, help with contributions?
Well, like I say, we're looking for funding for the project now. Given the pandemic, I didn't get as much done trick-or-treating for funds as I might have otherwise done, because it's an awkward thing to do over email. But so we're definitely looking for funders. If you, this information is all on the website and everything, but the idea is to have the project coordinated by the Rochester Institute of Technology, where they have a lot of interesting academic programs around open culture, open source, etc. I think they have a major in free and open source software or something. Don't quote me on that. It's something similar like that. So so that's kind of the plan, but we need funds, we need people who want to be advisors, and we need, to collect people to do interviews. I welcome any kind of help people want to extend. When I talk to people about this project, many people tell me that they think it's a worthwhile endeavor, and that's what has kept me going. But by this time, we probably need some funding in order to make it really live. So there's a variety of things that people can do, and I welcome help with any of them.
Excellent. And I suppose this leads us into the question of, when it comes to funding, do you have certain target type of companies that you think would be good for the rest of us to help approach, or should we just start spreading the word to everyone?
Well, I would love to see some participation from some of the bigger companies that benefit greatly from open source. I understand, because I've been a lawyer in this space for decades, that while many companies end up contributing to open source projects, some of them are more reticent about doing that. I understand that, but they are using open source software. This might be a way to contribute that doesn't consist of hand-wringing decisions about patent licensing, to be perfectly honest. So I'd love to see some of the corporations contribute, and some of the foundations who sponsor open source projects.
Okay, that sounds great. And I'm just going to throw the floor open in case anyone else has a question they'd like to raise to you. Oh, there we go, Sebastian. What kind of things would funding be needed for? So he's saying, for very specific projects, sponsorship, how would it be cat-herded?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when I first conceived this notion of doing an oral history, I knew nothing about what it took to do an oral history. As a matter of fact, it takes a fair amount of resources, and B, there are people who are very good at it, which would not include me. So I hooked up with a company called Their Story, which has a platform for oral history. And I learned a lot from the founder of that company, who was very generous with his time, and has had many calls with me trying to strategize about this. The funding is required because it requires resources to have interviewers. I did those interviews that you saw, but I'm certainly not the right person to do them. Generally, it's not really what I do. It takes a certain set of skills and training to do the interviews in the right way, in order to make sure that people are telling their stories and the interviewer is not like guiding the stories. And then you have to record them. You have to then store them. You have to index them. You have to do, a script so that people can search on the material by keywords and so forth. So there are resources to do all these things, but they're not for free. Then the Rochester Institute of Technology, I think, is also interested in perhaps creating some documentary films based on this, which I think would be a very interesting. So there's really a lot to do, and that's what the resources are required for. There is, by the way, an idea in the oral history community that when you record these things, you preserve them for as close to forever as you can. This idea is to create a little time capsule. So just like kind of sticking them on Google Drive, which is, what I would normally do, is not quite enough, because you need to think of a truly permanent way of storing things that is going to survive changes in formats and so forth and so on. So those are some of the things that are involved in creating an oral history.
That makes a lot of sense. Now we have some tangential questions. Someone's asking about open source licenses. So I'm not sure if you want to take this time, or you want to come back another time.
Well, so Thanks for the question. I actually advised Mongo on their move from AGPL to SSPL. It was highly controversial, and it was an interesting ride. I guess I can't say too much about it. I think Mongo's motivations were, were public. They were not a secret. What maybe was more interesting to the community was the level of controversy over SSPL being submitted to open source initiative for approval as an open source license. It was written with the intent to be an open source license. You've seen many companies switching over to what I would call source available. By the way, I've worked on many of those projects too, for better or worse. But actually, it was an attempt not to switch to a source available license. So it was one of those things where there was kind of a firestorm of controversy, and as always in those sorts of situations, some unexpected results. As far as I know, they're happy with the switch, and actually some other companies have adopted SSPL as well. Not a lot, but a few.
This might be something to have a topic on someday, because it's sort of a new area between open source and proprietary software. And it was inevitable this day would come as people noodled around business models and how to balance things out. So maybe we can do a whole webinar on that someday to explore it. There was a lot of knee-jerk reaction because it wasn't open source, but on the other hand, as you said, it was a way to avoid source available. So it's finding a new slot in the market space. And
yeah, well, I would say, by the way, being the devil's advocate, I would say it was open source, but then consider that I was representing Mongo at the time. So we wrote it with the intent to make it open source. By the way, I see the question about the guitar. That all of those videos, like I recorded the videos on the Their Story platform, which is actually pretty good for this kind of project. Has a lot of functionality that's useful for that, like whether you show one person or two, how you do the audio, etc. But then I had to put together the highlights reel that you just saw. And I did that using iMovie because that's about my level of sophistication on video production. But yeah, and you also noticed that two of the people there were from the Audacity project. That's because it's really one of my favorite open source projects that I've used for many years as a musician. And yeah, I dabble in this stuff, and I've also been the beneficiary of open source tools for audio and video production.
It's an interesting side note. Quite a few musicians I know, as well as podcast recorders and so on, use Audacity, which is, I think is a testament to the fact that the software has accomplished incredible things. It's no joke to try to record music. So
in my view, it's one of the best open source projects out there in a way, at least for applications. It's got an amazing worldwide community, and one thing I love about it is it has enough functionality but not too much. And one thing that was edited out of one of those interviews with Dominic, who was one of the he could probably be described as the head of the Audacity project. He said that one of the things he loved about developing open source software is that you were not required to add features all the time. Like, features were added if they were useful and necessary and the community wanted them. Whereas when he worked in proprietary development, he felt the pressure to add features every year in order to sell subscriptions and updates and so forth. And I just thought that was an amazingly insightful comment. I had never thought about that before, but one of my big complaints as a user of software is feature bloat. And it was interesting to hear him connect that to the proprietary development model, to me, that was a great insight.
That's actually a fascinating thing, given the way we've seen quite a few wonderful tools escalate in their features to the point where it takes a little bit of noodling to find what you want to do. But I mean, I guess that's the nature of yearly iterations. For those of you who are interested in the history of yearly iterations, the big push actually came in the 1950s with the automotive industry in the US when they had to introduce model years to shift metal. So Harley Earl is responsible for that in the design department. And it's still in automotive. I was fascinated to find out that a lot of car companies, they map out the products, like this car is going to be about 7 years in the market, and here are the advances every year. So the concept that, every year we're at the cutting edge of tech, not quite. We're at the sequential development of production lines.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I see the comment from Sammy. I hope I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
Sorry. Perhaps you can use an OpenChain project for non-coders. Can you tell me more? That's an interesting idea. Can you tell me more about your thoughts there?
And Sammy, would you like me to? I'll unmute you just in case you want to talk. So Sammy, I am just, let's see. Well, I'm asking.
Yeah, sorry, I can't
go.
find the unmute button. Yeah, no, I mean, I see, Heather, the reason why I mentioned this, I see the OpenChain project as a fantastic collaborative project where there were quite a lot of contributions and participation from those of us who are not specifically coders. And when you were talking about, should this be expanded, or the question was, should this be expanded to non-coders? I think the collaboration that we've had over the last 6-7 years in OpenChain is a really good example of that.
Oh, great. That's a great comment, actually. I like it because it's not software, right?
It is exactly. It's not software, and I just, my observation is that the spirit of open source is really was along the way, was in everything that we have done. So a fantastic example in my view.
That's a really great idea. Thank you very much for that idea. I'm going to keep that in mind. I really hope I can move this project, far beyond the original, interviews and make it much more inclusive. I mean, the group that I used was not any kind of model of an inclusive group, right? Except for I actually did get someone who wasn't from the US. That was enough work, but they were just like people I happened to know and were willing to talk to me. So yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you.
Welcome.
And in the immediate term, Heather, beside the release of the recording of this webinar, naturally we'll be promoting the project and direct linking to try to drive traffic up. And internationally, we have extensive reach throughout Asia and Europe, so hopefully we'll bring in some new faces. But I mean, the faces you collected gave an interesting insight. For instance, I've never seen any of the members of Audacity before, so
yeah.
it was.
They're not very public guys, really. I really actually would like to get some of the people who have been in the background for all these years. They're a little difficult to ferret out. And honestly, I reached out to a couple people who ultimately decided they didn't want to participate because they didn't even want to be on video talking about like anything. Like some of the people who participate and have contributed greatly to open source are really private people. And obviously those are not the people we hear from all the time, right? So I would really love to get some of those people to participate.
Yeah, that raises an interesting point, and it touches on what I think Bruce Perrins was saying, that because open source is so inclusive, we have a lot of different types of people, including people who aren't particularly social, who prefer code as, and as you said, we sort of are in a window where we've got maybe a couple of years to grab some stories before people head off into the sunset.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Persuading them to join in. Well, I think the great start is that the videos you've got are clearly easy to participate in, right? So it's not one of those 2-second attention span documentary things where it's trying to slam, slam, slam. So hopefully the existing example will bring in others, and certainly, we'll begin to promote it in OpenChain, and we would be very happy to bridge in international figures for interviews as well. There's some people who have different perspectives in places like China that might like to pop up and explain what they've been doing for the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. And by the way, I don't need to do the interviews, nor do, by the way, I also don't think I'm particularly good at doing the interviews. It's also a possibility that if someone wanted to participate, someone else could do the interview. It's just, a little like the platform's available, and basically all you do is like invite people to talk. In fact, I think one of the things that I did wrong during the interviews, because I didn't know any better, is I was too, I don't know, like active during the interviews, mainly because I wanted them to feel comfortable, but I don't think I got quite the right, you can hear me laughing in the background and stuff. I wish you couldn't hear that. But my point is, we can have other people do the interviews too, or I can help find someone do an interview. I'm hoping to involve some journalists who are in the open source space. But I feel like I need to compensate them for doing that. There are also some people who would probably volunteer.
Right. And it's good to know that other parties can also help contribute interviews. I think that might be fun for some people around the world to take part in.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Right now, you're project leader, right? So you're the primary contact.
I'm everything right now, but I really don't want to be.
Final note was from Sebastian. He finds it interesting that many open source communities have a majority of one geographical group, even when they're online. And he just notes OpenChain is one of the most graphically and culturally diverse. Yeah, on our side, I think it was because we decided to have work groups in individual languages. And sometimes there's an argument that will hinder. We took the opposite tack. We were like, well, everyone doesn't speak English, so off we go. And that was very good. Though I suppose conversely, you could say that OpenChain might have less brand momentum in a kind of single language jurisdiction like the United States than it does in multilingual zones such as China and Japan and so on.
Well, I think the interviews also don't necessarily need to be in English.
Could be subtitled.
Yeah, they could be, because the oral history platforms have ways of making a transcript, and then that could be translated. That takes some human effort, but it's definitely possible to do. But also, I think it might be interesting to get some participation about projects that are, that have a geographical limitation, like, the German project. Like, how is that different? I think that would be interesting.
That's a really good point. And let's just say hypothetically here, we haven't had great success in always getting this done, but if interviews are done in Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and German or whatever, we can probably help translate it through our community, through the volunteers. So that's something to do. Oh, Sebastian notes open source sociology. Here we go.
Exactly. I never intended to be a sociologist of any kind, but I kind of fell into this. And then I've been thinking a lot more about it lately as a result.
Well, it's a phenomenal project. And thank you for taking time out. I know it's early morning there in Pacific Daytime region, so much appreciated, Heather.
Got my coffee, so I'm okay.
And we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you for those of you who dialed in from, I see we've got a few people from China, actually. I know it's running late there. It's like 10:45 p.m. in China. So thank you for being here. And everyone in the middle, as always, it was great to have you here, Heather. Definitely want to bring you back for another chat, especially about interesting future innovations around licenses, if that's okay. And meanwhile,
Absolutely.
keep doing what you're doing. It's awesome.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining for the video. And the great comments. I really appreciate it.
Have a good day. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.